Hey dudes, imagine being so desperate to keep bugs away. You rubbed raw onion juice all over your body. That's what some early American settlers did. Because bug spray didn't exist, and the mosquitoes didn't care if you were exhausted, sunburned, or just trying to sleep. Tonight, we're heading back to that rough, itchy world, where survival meant strange solutions, and personal hygiene took a backseat to whatever worked. If slow, slightly gross history helps you wind down, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from, and how bad are the bugs where you live? Now dim the lights, breathe easy, and let's fall asleep to a time when onions weren't just for dinner. They were for defense. When we think about American settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries, we often imagine vast stretches of land, tall wooden houses, and the endless frontier. But what's rarely mentioned is the constant battle settlers faced, not against other people or the harsh wilderness, but against the smallest and most insidious of enemies, insects. The summer months in colonial America were a time of great hardship, especially for those who found themselves far from the comforts of well-established cities. The land was untamed, and while it offered many opportunities for those brave enough to carve out a life in the wilderness, it also presented dangers, many of which were invisible. Insects, particularly mosquitoes and ticks, swarmed the areas, near rivers, forests, and marshlands, where settlers frequently set up camp or homesteads. These pests carried disease, causing constant discomfort and even death. The settlers didn't have access to the insect repellents we rely on today. No off-spray, no citronella candles, no chemical repellents of any kind. In fact, they had few resources to protect themselves from the insects that thrived in the humid, often swampy conditions of the American colonies. Yet, in their struggle for survival, the settlers didn't just sit idly by. They began to experiment with what they had, and sometimes their solutions were more creative than anyone might expect. One such solution was something you might never guess: onion juice. It's a curious choice, isn't it? How could something as humble as the onion, something you might find in any kitchen today, be used as a weapon against swarms of mosquitoes and ticks? The answer lies in the practical mindset of early American settlers and their deep connection to the land. They knew that survival often meant finding solutions from nature itself, and that's exactly what they did. Onions, which were commonly grown in settlers' gardens, were a staple in colonial cuisine. They were cheap, widely available, and easy to cultivate. But in the colonies, the versatility of the onion was not limited to the kitchen. Settlers began to experiment with the strong-smelling juice of onions as a repellent. It's important to understand that these early colonists were far removed from modern science and medicine. While they may not have understood why onion juice worked, they were keenly aware of its effects. In a time when knowledge was often passed down through trial and error, many colonists found that rubbing onion juice on their skin seemed to have a remarkable effect. Mosquitoes, which were notorious for their buzzing attacks, were driven away by the pungent scent of the onions. Ticks, which carried diseases such as Lyme disease, were also deterred by the odor. The idea of using onion juice as a repellent quickly spread throughout the frontier communities, and many early settlers made it a routine part of their daily lives, applying it liberally before heading out to work in the fields or when venturing into the dense woods. But this raises a significant question. How did settlers even come to associate onions with this strange yet effective remedy? Was it simply the trial and error of everyday survival, or did it stem from a deeper ancestral knowledge of plants and their properties? And could there have been other, even stranger methods that were more effective, but simply forgotten over time? As we move forward in this story, we'll explore the origins of this unusual practice and how onion juice became an integral part of early American settler life. We'll also look at other fascinating and bizarre ways settlers tried to deal with the challenges of frontier life, from self-made insecticides to natural remedies they used for other health issues. As we delve deeper into the use of onion juice as a bug repellent, it's important to consider the broader context of early settlers' resourcefulness. These pioneers lived in a world without the conveniences of modern science and medicine. Instead, they relied heavily on their own observations, inherited knowledge, and trial and error experimentation to find solutions to the numerous challenges they faced, many of which involved maintaining their health and well-being in a rugged and often hostile environment. In this context, the use of onion juice as a repellent was just one of many folk remedies that settlers employed. Early settlers had to develop an intimate understanding of the natural world, as their survival depended on it. These remedies were passed down through families, often through generations, and became a vital part of the settler's toolkit. The onion, a simple and unassuming vegetable, had many uses beyond being a food staple. Its strong, pungent aroma, which many find unpleasant, was its greatest asset. While today we associate the smell of onions with the kitchen, settlers learned that the volatile oils released from crushed onions or onion juice had the ability to ward off insects. These oils contained sulfur compounds, substances known for their potent odor, that acted as a natural deterrent to mosquitoes, ticks, and other pests. The harsh smell interfered with the insect's ability to locate their prey, making it harder for them to bite or infest a person. Despite the seemingly absurd nature of this solution, the onion's effectiveness can be understood through the lens of natural biology. Many insects, particularly mosquitoes, rely on smell to locate their targets. The scent of human sweat, carbon dioxide, and body heat can be a signal to these insects that a potential meal is near. By overpowering these cues with the strong sulfuric smell of onion, settlers were able to reduce the number of insect bites they received. But how did these frontier people discover this? The answer is largely anecdotal. Settlers had few options, but to try whatever worked. It's likely that someone had, in desperation, rubbed onion juice on their skin after finding it to be effective in keeping other pests at bay. And once this discovery was made, word spread, as these remedies often did, through personal testimonies and family traditions. There was no scientific research to back these methods, but their practical results spoke volumes. Onions, however, were not the only tool in the settlers' arsenal. If you traveled across the frontier in the 17th or 18th century, you would have encountered a wide range of remedies designed to fight pests, sickness, and discomfort. From crushed herbs to handmade concoctions, settlers used whatever they could find to help them survive. One common and somewhat surprising remedy involved the use of tobacco. While we now associate tobacco with smoking, settlers understood that it could be used in a variety of ways, including as an insect repellent. Tobacco leaves were sometimes boiled in water and applied to the skin to ward off bugs. Tobacco smoke was also used to drive away mosquitoes and other flying pests. It's a strange but practical connection between two things we typically don't associate with each other: smoke and insects. Another common practice was the use of lavender and mint. These herbs, which could be grown in nearly any settler's garden, were prized for their strong aromatic scents, which were said to repel mosquitoes and other insects. Similarly, lemon balm, a member of the mint family, was commonly used by settlers to keep bugs at bay. The fragrant oils released by these plants seemed to be especially effective against flies and mosquitoes. The settlers didn't just rely on these herbal remedies, they also turned to the broader natural world for assistance. Citronella, which, is now a popular component of modern insect repellents, was also discovered and used by settlers. The citronella plant, with its lemony scent, was rubbed directly onto the skin or used to create a smoke that repelled insects. Though citronella became popularized later, it had been part of settlers' folk practices, often passed from one family to another. However, no discussion of frontier pest control would be complete without mentioning the role of smoke itself. As with tobacco, the settlers would use the general concept of fire to drive away insects. Smoky campfires were often used as a barrier to mosquitoes, particularly in the evenings when the pests were most active. Many settlers also built special smokehouses to preserve their food, but these structures inadvertently created an insect-free zone for them as well. Yet, for all their ingenuity, settlers still faced enormous challenges in battling pests. Even with these natural remedies, there were no guarantees that settlers could avoid the diseases carried by insects. Malaria, yellow fever, and other mosquito-borne illnesses decimated entire populations, especially in swampy, humid areas. The harsh reality was that despite all their attempts, settlers had to live with the constant threat of diseases and pests. In a way, this ongoing struggle against insects is a reflection of the broader difficulties settlers faced in colonizing America. They were constantly fighting not just against other humans or the environment, but against the invisible, persistent forces of nature. Their lives were shaped by these small but crucial battles for survival. And this raises the next question. What other secrets from these early days remain hidden in the folklore of settlers? Were there other natural remedies as odd and effective as onion juice, waiting to be rediscovered? What can we learn from these early pioneers about resilience and survival in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges? As we continue to explore the history of settler life, we'll delve into other peculiar remedies, practices, and survival strategies that were key to their endurance. We'll also consider how these techniques were passed down, influencing the future of health, practices, and the ways we understand pest control today. As we come to the final section of this story, we find ourselves not only reflecting on the surprising effectiveness of onion juice as a bug repellent, but also recognizing a much deeper truth about early American settlers, their resilience in the face of hardships. These early pioneers lived in a world where survival often hinged on their ability to adapt, learn from nature, and sometimes even embrace the most unlikely solutions to problems that we now take for granted. The use of onion juice as an insect repellent is just one example of how settlers, through trial and error, managed to make the best use of the limited resources available to them. It may seem like a simple, almost quaint solution, but it was part of a larger pattern of ingenuity and survival. In the absence of modern medical knowledge, settlers had to rely on the land itself, using whatever plants, animals, and natural substances they could find to help them survive. They didn't just see nature as something to conquer, but as a vital partner in their daily lives. The onion juice remedy is particularly fascinating because of its simplicity. It's easy to dismiss as a folk tale or an old wives' tale, but in reality, it highlights an important aspect of early American survival. Settlers often found solutions that worked through persistence and observation. While we now know that modern insect repellents are much more effective, the fact that settlers found a natural remedy that worked, even if imperfectly, speaks volumes about their ability to make do with what they had. But the legacy of these remedies goes beyond just repelling insects. The practices that settlers developed have had lasting effects on modern-day approaches to both health and pest control. We see echoes of these early practices in the herbal remedies that are still popular today, many of which can be traced back to the plants and substances that settlers relied on. The onion juice, tobacco, lavender, and citronella oils that they used have all influenced modern natural pest control solutions. Interestingly, the role of insects in shaping human history is still a subject of study today. Researchers now look at how pests, from mosquitoes to ticks, have influenced the course of history, spreading disease, altering the outcome of wars, and even shaping migration patterns. While modern science has provided us with advanced methods of pest control and disease prevention, it's important to remember that the battle against insects was one of the many small yet significant struggles that shaped the lives of settlers. In fact, the story of onion juice as a bug repellent is just one part of a much larger story about how settlers dealt with the invisible threats of their environment. They didn't have the benefits of modern medicine, vaccines, or advanced technology, yet they managed to not only survive, but build a thriving nation. Their methods, though simple by today's standards, represent a profound understanding of the natural world and a level of resourcefulness that we might overlook. What's particularly striking about these early solutions is how closely they align with today's growing interest in sustainable natural living. In recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in natural remedies, herbal medicine, and organic methods of pest control. People are increasingly turning to plants, oils, and substances that our ancestors used for survival, whether it's garlic, eucalyptus, or yes, even onion juice. This movement back to nature is, in many ways, a modern reflection of what settlers did centuries ago, finding simple, natural solutions to everyday problems. But as we reflect on the legacy of onion juice and other folk remedies, we must also acknowledge that there are aspects of settler life that have been lost to history. Many of the methods used by settlers have been overshadowed by more efficient, chemical-based solutions, and some have been forgotten entirely. For example, the art of crafting homemade remedies and understanding the medicinal properties of local plants has been lost to modern medicine's rapid advancements. And while we may now look at some of these old methods with amusement, they played a crucial role in shaping the lives of early Americans. The question remains, what else have we lost in the march toward modernity? Are there simple, natural remedies still out there, waiting to be rediscovered, that could help us solve the problems we face today? It's a thought-provoking question because in many ways, we may be overlooking the wisdom of the past as we chase more complex solutions. The story of onion juice serves as a reminder of the ingenuity and determination that has always been at the heart of human survival. It teaches us that history is full of small, seemingly insignificant details that, when examined closely, reveal profound insights into the ways humans have adapted to the challenges of their environment. These stories, though boring or overlooked by many, are the very fabric of history. They remind us that even the most mundane aspects of daily life can have lasting significance, shaping our present and future in ways we may not fully appreciate until we look back. As we finish this story, we find ourselves reflecting not just on the practical survival strategies of the past, but on how they shape the world we live in today. The persistence of settlers, their creativity, and their connection to the land remain a powerful testament to human resilience. The question remains, what lessons can we learn from these early survival stories, and how can they influence our own approach to the challenges of modern life? Can we find wisdom in the past to help us face our future? This story of settlers, onions, and bug repellent may have seemed like an odd tale at first, but it's one that reveals something far deeper about our shared history and the ways small practical solutions can have a lasting impact. In the bustling towns of 18th century colonial America, there existed a peculiar but vital figure whose presence was felt by nearly every member of the community: the apothecary. In an age before modern pharmacies, hospitals, and doctors' offices, the apothecary was a central figure in the health and wellness of early settlers. Often working in small, dimly lit shops filled with the scent of herbs, oils, and tinctures. Apothecaries provided remedies for a wide variety of ailments, yet their practices were far from what we would recognize as modern medicine. The apothecaries' role in colonial America was complex and multifaceted. They were part pharmacist, part physician, part herbalist, and part community healer. While a few doctors had received formal education in Europe, the majority of early American settlers had little access to professional medical care. It was the apothecary who became the first line of defense when it came to treating everything from fevers and colds to more serious injuries and diseases. In many rural towns, apothecaries were the most educated medical practitioners available, and they were trusted with both the physical and spiritual well-being of their patients. However, the practices of the 18th century apothecary were not as scientifically sound as we might imagine today. In an era without antibiotics, anesthesia, or advanced diagnostic tools, treatments were often based on folklore, trial and error, and the natural world. The apothecary's shelves were lined with jars of strange concoctions, bottles of infusions, poultices, and powders, many of which were concocted from plants, minerals, and animal products. These remedies, while crude by modern standards, were considered vital to the daily survival of early settlers. In fact, it was the apothecary who introduced settlers to many of the herbs and natural remedies that would form the backbone of early American medicine. The roots of many of these remedies can still be seen in contemporary alternative medicine and herbalism. These early healers often relied on a vast array of plants: sage, yarrow, lavender, and peppermint, each with purported healing properties. But what exactly were these remedies, and how did they shape early American health practices? One of the most common treatments in the apothecary's shop was botanical medicine. Herbs were not just used for flavoring food, but as potent medicinal agents that could help alleviate a range of symptoms. For example, peppermint was often brewed into a tea to settle upset stomachs, while lavender was believed to help with headaches and nervous disorders. Chamomile was another favorite, used for its calming effects and as a remedy for insomnia. But it wasn't just plants that apothecaries used. Many relied on minerals such as mercury or sulfur, and even animal products like leech saliva and cow dung to treat various ailments. While many of these treatments now seem bizarre or even dangerous, they were part of the limited medical knowledge available to settlers. The role of the apothecary was not just to treat physical ailments, but to navigate the sometimes murky waters between superstition, folk medicine, and early scientific methods. The apothecary's knowledge came not only from formal training, which was often minimal, but also from a variety of sources, including European traditions. Many apothecaries were influenced by the practices of British and French medical authorities, who introduced herbal remedies and various forms of surgery to the colonies. Yet, at the same time, the apothecary was deeply connected to the American landscape, with settlers often using the plants and materials available in their local environments. To understand just how widespread apothecaries were, one only needs to consider the distance between towns and the lack of formal medical schools. In the 18th century, American settlers were scattered across vast, isolated areas, with few roads or established communication networks. A visit to a doctor was often a multi-day journey, and by the time a patient reached the physician, it was too late for treatment. This gap in medical care left settlers relying heavily on their local apothecary, who often became a trusted advisor, for a variety of ailments. Yet, how effective were these remedies, and how much did they really help? This question is important, especially considering the high mortality rate of children and the frequent outbreaks of disease. It's easy to assume that the apothecary's remedies were simply ineffective. But, as we'll explore in the next section, The apothecary's role in health and survival was far more significant than it might appear. As we step further into the apothecary's world, it becomes clear that the remedies used by early American healers were not based on scientific knowledge as we understand it today. Instead, these treatments were a mixture of ancient traditions, local knowledge, and sheer trial and error. The apothecary's work was part of a broader medical landscape in which the lines between the mystical, the practical, and the superstitious were often blurred. Let's consider the poultice, a key component of an apothecary's daily routine. This simple remedy, often made from herbs, clay, or even bread, was applied to wounds or injuries in an attempt to draw out infection or alleviate pain. For example, a poultice of mustard seeds was commonly used to treat chest colds and respiratory issues. The idea behind the poultice was based on the belief that heat and pressure could extract bad humors from the body, a theory that originated from the ancient Greek concept of balancing bodily fluids. While today we know that the healing properties of poultices come from the application of heat or moisture, early settlers weren't concerned with understanding the science. Instead, they focused on what worked, which often required years of collective experience. Herbal infusions were another mainstay in the apothecary's shop. These teas and tinctures were crafted from plants found in the surrounding forests and fields. The elderberry, for instance, was a widely used remedy for colds and fevers. Echinacea was used as a stimulant to boost the immune system, and witch hazel was applied to treat skin conditions and inflammation. These plants were often harvested during specific times of the year when they were believed to have the most potent healing properties. Some of the remedies were passed down from indigenous tribes, who had long utilized plants for medicinal purposes, while others were introduced by European settlers. Yet, not all remedies were as harmless as they might seem. Mercury, a substance now known to be highly toxic, was once considered a cure-all. It was used in a variety of treatments, from poultices to ingested tinctures, with the idea that it could purify the blood and cure ailments such as syphilis. Ironically, while mercury was frequently used for its supposed health benefits, it likely caused long-term damage to many people's health. The settlers did not understand the dangers of mercury poisoning, and it wasn't until much later that its toxic effects became widely recognized. Equally shocking was the use of bloodletting, a practice that was common in both Europe and the colonies. Bloodletting involved draining blood from a patient in an attempt to balance the body's humors. Although there is no scientific basis for this practice, it was a widely accepted treatment for everything from fevers to mental illness. A leech was often used to drain the blood, but in some cases, a razor would be used to make small incisions. The theory behind bloodletting was rooted in the ancient belief that illness was caused by an imbalance in the body's fluids. The idea of balancing these humors through bloodletting persisted for centuries and was practiced well into the 19th century. Another method that was widely used, though it may seem strange to us today, was the use of tonics. These were mixtures of herbs, alcohol, and sometimes even opium, designed to stimulate the body and mind. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was a popular remedy for pain and a variety of ailments, including digestive issues and anxiety. For many settlers, these tonics provided relief from physical and emotional suffering, though the long-term effects of such substances were poorly understood. Laudanum was often used to calm children, alleviate pain, and even as a sleep aid. In many cases, people became addicted to these tonics, leading to a host of other health problems. While some of these remedies may sound alarming, it's important to remember that the apothecary operated within a much different framework of medical understanding. Without the tools and technology of modern medicine, they were forced to rely on whatever substances they could find in nature or through trade. They were constantly experimenting, and the line between medicine and superstition was often thin. At the same time, apothecaries did make important contributions to the growing body of medical knowledge. Many of the remedies they used, particularly the herbal ones, were effective in treating certain conditions. For instance, willow bark, a common ingredient in early apothecary shops, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Ginseng, another staple in early American medicine, has long been used to boost energy and improve overall health. In many ways, the apothecary was more than just a healer. They were a gatekeeper to survival, often offering hope when it seemed in short supply. In the case of outbreaks of diseases such as smallpox or yellow fever, the apothecary was often the only one in the community who could provide relief. They administered inoculations, prepared remedies to ease symptoms, and helped comfort families facing the loss of loved ones. In times of widespread illness, they were critical figures in the community, relied upon not only for their knowledge of remedies, but also for their ability to keep calm in the face of disaster. It's important to recognize, however, that even though apothecaries were often educated and well-versed in the medical knowledge of their time, their practices were limited by the lack of access to more advanced medical training. They worked with what they had, and while many of their methods seem outdated or even dangerous by modern standards, they laid the groundwork for the medical advancements that would follow. But what lessons can we learn from these early medical practices? How did their reliance on natural remedies and local knowledge shape the development of modern medicine? Could we be overlooking the wisdom of these early practitioners, particularly as we turn to more holistic and natural approaches in today's health practices? As we prepare to close this chapter of early American medicine, it's worth pondering how far we've come in our understanding of health and healing, and what aspects of the past might still have a place in our future. As we come to the final section of our exploration into the apothecary's life, it becomes clear that the practices of these early medical practitioners, while primitive by today's standards, laid the groundwork for much of the medical knowledge and practices we have today. The apothecary was not just a relic of the past, but a figure who helped bridge the gap between ancient herbal traditions and the scientific advancements of the modern world. Their legacy is evident in many aspects of modern medicine, even if we no longer rely on the same crude remedies they used. The apothecary was often seen as a source of local knowledge deeply embedded in the community. Their shop wasn't just a place of business. It was a cultural hub where people came not only for remedies, but for advice on health, wellness, and even personal matters. They were trusted figures, with knowledge passed down through generations, often combining folk wisdom with the latest scientific thinking of the time. Despite the crude nature of their treatments, they were often the most educated individuals in their towns, sometimes with years of practical experience in a time when formal medical schools were few and far between. One of the most significant ways in which the apothecary shaped modern medicine was in their approach to herbalism. Today, we know that many of the plants used by 18th century apothecaries have real medicinal value. For example, willow bark, used for pain relief, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Echinacea, used by settlers for its purported immune-boosting properties, has since been studied for its effects on immune health. And lavender, long used to calm the nerves and treat headaches, is still a popular remedy today in aromatherapy and stress relief. These plants weren't just random choices, but were often picked for their proven effectiveness, passed down through both indigenous knowledge and European traditions. In fact, many of the medicines that we take for granted today, like antibiotics, can trace their roots back to the kinds of herbal remedies that apothecaries once used. Penicillin, for example, was discovered in the early 20th century, but the Foundations of its use were laid centuries earlier when settlers relied on molds and herbs to treat infections. While the modern pharmaceutical industry has moved away from these natural sources, the apothecary's role as a precursor to today's pharmaceutical practices cannot be denied. In addition to herbalism, the art of compound preparation was another legacy of the apothecary. Apothecaries were skilled in creating tinctures, salves, and powders, often blending various ingredients to achieve specific therapeutic effects. These practices have influenced the creation of modern pharmaceutical formulations, pills, ointments, and syrups that combine multiple compounds to target specific health issues. While today's pharmaceuticals are more standardized and scientifically tested, the basic principles of compounding medicine were first developed in apothecary shops. But beyond the physical remedies, the apothecary's legacy lies in their approach to personalized care. Modern medicine tends to focus on generalized treatments, where one-size-fits-all solutions are applied to large populations. However, in the 18th century, the apothecary treated each patient individually. They would take into account a person's specific symptoms, lifestyle, and even temperament, tailoring treatments to their unique needs. This approach to personalized care, although limited by the available knowledge at the time, foreshadowed the more patient-centered care models that are becoming increasingly popular today. Modern integrative medicine, which blends conventional treatments with alternative approaches, owes much to the holistic mindset practiced by early apothecaries. While the apothecary's reliance on mercury, bloodletting, and other now outdated practices might make us cringe today, it is important to recognize that their work was done in the absence of modern diagnostic tools like X-rays, MRIs, or blood tests. They had no way of testing for diseases like Lyme disease, tuberculosis, or malaria, yet they still had to deal with the symptoms and consequences of these diseases. Their methods, while crude, were the best available at the time, and many of their remedies provided real comfort to patients, whether they fully understood why they worked or not. Moreover, the apothecary's work in preventative care was an important precursor to modern health practices. While they didn't have access to vaccines or antibiotics, they understood the importance of maintaining a healthy lifestyle. Many apothecaries emphasized hygiene, nutrition, and exercise as important factors in preventing illness. These basic principles are the foundation of modern preventative medicine, which focuses on lifestyle changes and early intervention to reduce the risk of disease. In the world of medicine today, the field of herbalism continues to thrive, with many people seeking out natural remedies as alternatives or complements to traditional pharmaceuticals. What's perhaps most interesting is how certain remedies, once dismissed as old wives' tales, are now being rediscovered and researched in the modern world. Herbal supplements, essential oils, and natural treatments have seen a resurgence in popularity as people seek out more holistic health options. In this way, the apothecary's blend of natural medicine, personal care, and experiential knowledge is still relevant today, despite the advances of modern medicine. The apothecary's role in the community, however, was not only about health and healing. These individuals were trusted figures who often had a deep understanding of their patients' lives. They were not just dispensing remedies, they were also dispensing advice. They played a role in people's everyday lives, offering comfort in times of illness and, in some cases, solace in the face of death. This compassionate approach to healing, where the person was seen as more than just a set of symptoms, is something that modern medicine could stand to learn from. As we reflect on the apothecary's legacy, we are reminded of how medicine has always been more than just a science. It is also an art. And while modern medicine is rooted in cutting-edge research and technology, we should not overlook the valuable lessons learned from the apothecaries of early America. Their creativity, resourcefulness, and holistic understanding of health laid the foundation for many of the practices we now consider essential to modern care. In conclusion, the apothecary's legacy is not just found in the medicines they created, but in the very approach to healing that they embodied through a mix of ancient wisdom, local knowledge, and sheer determination. They played a pivotal role in shaping the future of medicine. And as we move forward in our own medical practices, perhaps we would do well to remember the apothecary's commitment to personalized care, natural remedies, and a deep understanding of the human body and its needs. The dream of a transcontinental railroad in the United States was an idea that spanned decades, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast and promising to revolutionize the nation's economy, transportation, and way of life. It would become one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century and a defining moment in the history of the United States. Yet, as with many monumental achievements, the reality of building this railroad was far less glamorous than the grand vision. The story of the first transcontinental railroad begins in the years following the Civil War, during a time when the US was trying to heal its wounds and rebuild a fractured nation. The country was expanding westward, and settlers were moving to new territories, seeking land and opportunity. Yet despite the expansion of settlements, transportation across the vast, often treacherous terrain remained a significant challenge. The promise of an efficient and reliable way to travel from coast to coast was an alluring vision, but how could it be achieved? The idea of a transcontinental railroad had been proposed even before the Civil War, but it wasn't until 1862, with the signing of the Pacific Railway Act by President Abraham Lincoln, that it began to take real form. The act provided federal support for the construction of the railroad, offering land grants and government bonds to the companies that would undertake the task. The Union Pacific Railroad, which would build the track from the east, and the Central Pacific Railroad, which would build from the west, were given the task of connecting the two coasts. The project was immense, requiring thousands of workers, massive resources, and an unyielding drive to overcome the natural obstacles that lay in the way. The idea of a railroad connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific was exciting, but the journey to make it a reality would prove to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The challenges were not just technical, but social, political, and economic. The vast expanses of the American West were rugged and largely uncharted, with mountain ranges, deserts, and hostile terrain to overcome. The workers who would make this vision a reality were often overlooked by history, people who toiled day and night in dangerous conditions without the recognition they deserved. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad relied on a massive labor force. The work was grueling, often requiring long hours in extreme weather conditions. Many of the laborers were immigrants, especially Chinese laborers brought in by the Central Pacific Railroad, who made up a significant portion of the workforce. They faced intense prejudice and discrimination, yet they were crucial to the completion of the project. The Union Pacific Railroad, on the other hand, employed primarily Irish immigrants, as well as veterans of the Civil War, who also faced their own hardships as they laid track through the harsh Midwest. While much has been written about the political and economic importance of the railroad, the stories of the workers who built it are often left untold. These men and women labored in the most dangerous conditions imaginable, often working with explosives to blast through mountains, building tunnels, bridges, and laying miles of track through barren deserts. The toll on the workers was enormous, and thousands died during the construction, either from accidents or from diseases like cholera and malaria. Yet despite these challenges, the workers pressed on, driven by the knowledge that they were part of something much larger than themselves, a project that would change the course of American history. But how did these workers manage to endure such harsh conditions? What motivated them to keep going when the odds seemed insurmountable? Were there moments of doubt, or did they believe, as many of their superiors did, that they were helping to build the future of the nation? The answer is not a simple one, but as we look at the daily lives of these workers, we begin to see the incredible resilience and determination that were required to bring the transcontinental railroad to fruition. It wasn't just about laying track, it was about creating a lifeline that would connect two coasts, unite a divided nation, and spark the rapid development of the American West. As the Transcontinental Railroad project took shape, the lives of the men who built it became increasingly grueling, filled with hardships that are often forgotten in the retelling of this monumental achievement. The workers who laid the tracks through the unforgiving landscape were not just faced with the physical challenge of the task at hand, but with social, cultural, and personal struggles that would shape the history of the railroad in profound ways. The workers of the Central Pacific Railroad, predominantly Chinese immigrants, faced some of the harshest conditions. After arriving on the West Coast, many of them came from a background of poverty and limited opportunities in China, lured by the promise of steady work and a chance to earn money. However, what they encountered was far from what they expected. The work was physically demanding and dangerous, requiring them to labor in the harshest environments imaginable. The workers were tasked with blasting through the Sierra Nevada mountains, using explosives to carve a path through solid rock. The high-altitude terrain, extreme weather, and the constant threat of landslides made this task perilous. In some cases, entire crews were buried alive in accidents, and the deaths were often not even officially recognized. Despite these risks, the Chinese laborers pressed on, driven by the need to earn a living and the sense that their work would contribute to something greater than themselves. At the same time, the Irish laborers working for the Union Pacific Railroad were battling their own set of challenges. Unlike the Chinese immigrants who faced racial discrimination, the Irish workers were generally looked upon with more favor, though they still faced their own struggles. The Irish had arrived in large numbers during the mid-19th century, fleeing famine and poverty in Ireland, and they brought with them a strong sense of solidarity and community. The work they did was no less difficult than that of the Chinese laborers. The Union Pacific track was laid across the vast, flat prairies, often in temperatures that soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and plummeted below freezing in the winter. The workers were subject to constant exposure to the elements, and while they faced fewer physical obstacles than those working on the mountainous terrain of the West, they were equally vulnerable to diseases, accidents, and the dangers of working with explosives. It is said that the Irish workers were particularly resilient because they saw the railroad as a path to a new life in America, one where they could earn enough money to send back home to their families or establish themselves in the expanding economy of the United States. The most visible and well-known workers of the railroad's construction were the laborers who laid the tracks, but the women who worked behind the scenes also played a crucial role in the success of the project. While not as celebrated as the men who did the physical labor, women in the railroad camps worked tirelessly to provide the services and support necessary for the men to continue their work. Women cooked meals for the workers, helped establish schools for the children of laborers, and took on roles as nurses in the many makeshift hospitals that were set up to treat injuries and illnesses. These women were often the unsung heroes of the railroad's construction, offering emotional support to families separated from their loved ones for long stretches of time, and holding communities together in the midst of extreme hardship. Yet, the lives of these workers were not only marked by grueling physical labor, they were also shaped by racism, discrimination, and prejudice. The Chinese laborers, despite being crucial to the success of the Central Pacific, were seen as expendable by many of their employers. They worked in dangerous conditions and were often paid less than their Irish counterparts. When the railroad was completed, they were often pushed aside, their contributions overlooked. The Irish, while generally treated with more respect, were still viewed as inferior by many Americans, who saw them as a threat to the job market. Tensions between the two groups were high, and clashes occasionally broke out. However, despite these racial and social divides, the workers of the Transcontinental Railroad shared something that transcended their differences: a shared sense of purpose. They were all part of the same larger mission to create something that had never been done before. The vision of a railroad that connected the entire United States, from the bustling cities of the East to the untamed West, was a dream that united them, even as they endured hardship and sacrifice. In the face of overwhelming challenges, the laborers on the railroad became symbols of resilience. They carried the weight of a nation's ambitions on their shoulders and bore the burdens of work that many would not even consider. While they faced harsh conditions and often received little recognition, the significance of their efforts cannot be overstated. It was their sweat, their strength, and their determination that ultimately laid the foundation for the nation's future. But this raises an important question. Why have the laborers who built the Transcontinental Railroad been so largely forgotten in the history books, while the names of the engineers and businessmen who managed the project are well known? The stories of the workers who made it possible are often left untold. Could it be that their contributions were overlooked because they were considered mere laborers, not important figures in the eyes of history? How would our understanding of the Transcontinental Railroad change if we remembered and honored the lives and struggles of those who built it, rather than just the architects of the project? The answer lies in the long history of inequality and invisibility in American history. The contributions of immigrant workers, whether Chinese, Irish, or other marginalized groups, have often been erased or minimized in favor of celebrating the great men who led the way. However, it is essential that we begin to recognize the importance of these workers and the tremendous impact they had not only on the construction of the railroad, but on the shaping of the American West. On May 10, 1869, the completion of the first Transcontinental Railroad was celebrated in a ceremony at Promontory Summit, Utah, where the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad tracks finally met. The driving of the Golden Spike marked the moment when the east and west coasts of the United States were finally connected by rail, a feat that had been dreamed of for decades. The ceremony was widely covered in the press, and it was heralded as a momentous achievement for the nation. Politicians, business leaders, and engineers stood proudly at the summit, shaking hands, smiling, and celebrating the unification of the country. However, as the cameras flashed and the celebratory speeches were made, a significant part of the story was left untold, the story of the thousands of laborers who had made this achievement possible. For the workers who had spent years laying tracks across mountains, deserts, and prairies, the ceremony was not a moment of recognition, but a reminder of how little their contributions were acknowledged. The Chinese workers, who had toiled under extremely difficult conditions for years, were largely excluded from the celebration. The few who had been allowed to attend the ceremony were there as part of the crowd, not as honored guests. In fact, the contributions of the Chinese laborers were not fully acknowledged until much later, when their role in the railroad's construction was recognized in historical accounts. Despite their immense contribution, they were often viewed with suspicion and disdain by the larger American society. The Irish laborers, while somewhat more recognized, still faced their own battles with prejudice and discrimination. Yet, both groups had worked side by side, enduring the harshest conditions, to build what would become a symbol of American progress and expansion. In the years following the completion of the railroad, many of the workers who had made it possible were, Either forgotten or left behind, the Chinese laborers, who had been instrumental in building the railroad, were often pushed out of the workforce and faced severe discrimination. Many of them were relegated to menial labor, their achievements overshadowed by the racial prejudices of the time. The Irish workers, too, faced hardships, with many of them struggling to find work after the railroad was completed. Despite these challenges, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad marked the beginning of an era of rapid expansion for the United States. The railroad opened up the West to settlement, trade, and commerce, and it fundamentally changed the country's economic and social landscape. Cities like San Francisco, Chicago, and Salt Lake City flourished, and the once isolated territories became more connected to the rest of the nation. The railroad also had a profound impact on Native American populations. As settlers moved westward, they brought with them new diseases, technologies, and ways of life that drastically altered the lives of indigenous peoples. The Transcontinental Railroad was both a symbol of progress and a tool of displacement, as it facilitated the further colonization of the American West and the destruction of Native American cultures. But what lasting legacy did the workers of the railroad leave behind? The reality is that their contributions are still visible in the world today. The Transcontinental Railroad became a cornerstone of American industry, setting the stage for the country's rise as a global economic power. It transformed the way goods were transported, enabling the efficient movement of products and people across vast distances. The railroad also set the foundation for the creation of a national economy, linking distant regions of the country and helping to create a unified marketplace. Moreover, the story of the workers who built the railroad is one of resilience and perseverance. Their labor, their sacrifices, and their efforts were crucial not only in completing the railroad, but also in building the foundation of the modern United States. The workers, the Chinese, the Irish, and all those who contributed played a pivotal role in the shaping of the American West and in the development of a nation that would become a global power. Yet their stories were largely forgotten for many years. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began to seriously examine the contributions of the immigrant laborers who built the railroad. The recognition of their sacrifices is part of a larger effort to reframe American history, acknowledging the contributions of marginalized groups who were often erased from the dominant narrative. Today, the legacy of the workers who built the Transcontinental Railroad lives on in various ways. Memorials and museums, such as those at Promontory Summit in Sacramento, now highlight the contributions of these workers. Chinese American and Irish American communities take pride in their ancestors' role in this monumental achievement, and the construction of the railroad continues to be a subject of fascination for historians, filmmakers, and educators who seek to tell the full story of the Transcontinental Railroad. As we reflect on the history of the Transcontinental Railroad and the workers who made it possible, we are reminded of how history is often shaped by the labor and sacrifices of people who remain invisible in the popular imagination. The workers of the railroad, with their sweat, blood, and determination, were the ones who made the dream of a connected nation a reality. They are the unsung heroes whose contributions were overshadowed by the broader narrative of American progress. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how many other stories of resilience, struggle, and triumph are still waiting to be told in history? How many contributions, often overlooked and forgotten, have shaped the world we live in today, but have yet to be fully acknowledged? The story of the Transcontinental Railroad reminds us that history is not just the story of great men or grand events, but of the countless individuals whose labor and lives form the very foundation of our nation. As we close this chapter, we are left with a final reflection. How do we ensure that the laborers who built the United States, those who laid the tracks of the transcontinental railroad and worked in countless other industries, are remembered for the significant role they played in shaping the world we know today? When we think about life in colonial America, we often imagine settlers cultivating the land, building homes, and establishing communities. But one crucial, often overlooked aspect of their daily lives was the challenge of keeping food fresh and preserving it for the long winters when fresh produce was scarce. In a time before refrigerators, freezers, and modern preservatives, early Americans relied on a variety of food preservation techniques to ensure they could survive the harsh seasons and the unpredictable food supply of the colonies. In the early years of American colonization, food preservation was a matter of life and death. Without the convenience of modern transportation networks or grocery stores, settlers had to rely on the land itself to provide for them, especially during the long winters when travel was difficult and crops were dormant. The methods they developed to preserve food were labor-intensive and time-consuming, but essential to their survival. The most common food preservation techniques in colonial America were salting, drying, pickling, and smoking. These methods were passed down through generations and were deeply rooted in European traditions, but the settlers had to adapt them to their new environment. Each technique had its own set of challenges, and each had its own unique benefits, but all were designed with one goal in mind: to extend the shelf life of food and ensure that there would be enough to eat when fresh food became scarce. Salting was one of the oldest and most widely used methods of food preservation. The technique worked by drawing moisture out of food, creating an environment where bacteria and mold couldn't thrive. Salted meats, especially pork and beef, were staples of colonial diets, particularly in the winter months when hunting was less abundant. Salted fish, especially cod, was another important food source. Salted foods could be stored for long periods of time, often in barrels or other containers, and were crucial for survival in the early colonies, where fresh meat was not always readily available. Drying was another essential preservation method. Fruits, vegetables, and meats could all be dried in the sun or over a fire. Dried apples and dried corn were common in colonial kitchens, and dried meats like jerky were popular as well. The key to successful drying was removing as much moisture as possible, which prevented spoilage and bacterial growth. Many early American families had drying racks or smokehouses where they would hang meats, fish, and produce to dry. Pickling was a method that relied on vinegar, brine, or fermentation to preserve food. Pickled vegetables, particularly cucumbers, carrots, and cabbage, were common in colonial kitchens. Pickling not only extended the shelf life of foods, but also added a distinct flavor that became a staple in colonial cuisine. Fermentation was also used for preserving foods like cabbage, which could be turned into sauerkraut, or for creating beverages like hard cider or beer, which were often safer to drink than water in the early years of colonization. Finally, smoking was another essential technique that both preserved food and added flavor. Smoked meats, particularly ham, bacon, and fish, were common in the colonies, and smoking was also used to preserve cheese and sausages. Smokehouses were an essential part of colonial life, and families would often spend days preparing their food for preservation, ensuring that they had enough to eat when fresh supplies were unavailable. But food preservation was not just about survival. It was also about innovation and adaptation. As settlers encountered new plants, animals, and environmental challenges, they developed new methods of preserving the foods that they couldn't find elsewhere. Many settlers experimented with native crops such as pumpkins, squash, and beans, discovering ways to preserve these new foods for the winter. These techniques were slowly refined, passed from one generation to the next, and became an essential part of colonial cuisine. However, preserving food wasn't just about what could be done with the food once it was grown. It was also about how the food was grown and harvested. In many ways, food preservation in colonial America was an intricate, year-round process that required careful planning and preparation. A successful harvest was only the first step. After that, it was essential to store and preserve the food so that it could last through the winter. But what about the social and cultural aspects of food preservation? How did these methods shape the colonial lifestyle? What impact did these techniques have on the way early Americans viewed food and sustenance? Food preservation in colonial America was far more than a mere survival tactic. It was a reflection of the settlers' resourcefulness, creativity, and connection to the land. The methods they developed didn't just allow them to get through the long winters, they also shaped their cultural identity and social structures in profound ways. In the early days of colonization, the settlers had to rely heavily on local ingredients and traditional methods passed down from their European ancestors. As they adapted to the new environment, they began to experiment with native foods and ingredients that were unfamiliar to them, but available in abundance. For instance, corn and beans, which were staples for Native Americans, became essential parts of the settlers' diets and preservation techniques. The integration of these new foods into the colonial foodways marked a significant shift in both the colonists' understanding of food and the ways they preserved it. The act of preserving food was often a community effort. It wasn't just about individual families making their own preserves, pickles, and dried meats. It was a communal activity, particularly during harvest time. Fall harvest festivals were not only about celebrating the bounty of the land, but also about working together to preserve that bounty for the harsh months ahead. Neighbors would gather to can, pickle, and dry food, sharing knowledge, recipes, and labor. In this sense, food preservation was a form of social cohesion, strengthening the bonds between families and communities. The role of women in food preservation was especially significant. Women were largely responsible for maintaining the household and the food supply. They were the ones who managed the kitchen, prepared the preserves, and made sure that the larder was stocked for the winter. For women, food preservation was an expression of care for their families. It was their way of ensuring that everyone had enough to eat during the lean months, and it reflected a deep understanding of the importance of maintaining a sustainable food supply. Food preservation techniques were passed from mother to daughter, and recipes for pickles, jams, and dried meats became part of the family's heritage. These practices didn't just sustain families, they defined them. Food preservation also had a significant economic impact on colonial America. The ability to preserve food allowed settlers to trade with one another and with indigenous peoples. For example, pickled vegetables and dried meats were traded with neighboring colonies or with Native American tribes, and the exchange of preserved foods became an important part of colonial economies. Farmers who had an abundant harvest could sell or barter the excess, and preservation allowed them to expand their market by selling goods throughout the year, rather than just during harvest time. In many cases, food preservation techniques were also linked to the larger economic forces at play in the colonies. The sugar trade, for example, had a profound impact on the ways that settlers preserved fruit. Jams, jellies, and preserves made with sugar became essential parts of the colonial diet. But the sugar used in these preserves was often imported from the Caribbean, where sugar plantations relied on enslaved labor. The relationship between the economy of colonial America and the food preservation industry is a complex one, tied to both local agricultural practices and the broader transatlantic economy. The importance of preserved food in the colonies can also be seen in the way it affected the development of colonial cuisine. The long winters in the northern colonies, for instance, meant that settlers had to rely heavily on preserved fruits and vegetables to make it through. In the absence of fresh produce, pickled cucumbers, preserved berries, and sauerkraut became common dishes on the dinner table. Similarly, meats that had been salted or smoked became central to the diet. What began as a practical necessity, preserving food to survive, eventually became integrated into the cultural fabric of colonial cuisine. The slow revolution of food. Preservation was also tied to the changing role of technology in colonial kitchens. Early settlers had access to rudimentary tools like wooden barrels, stoneware crocks, and simple drying racks. However, over time, these technologies evolved, and settlers began to develop more sophisticated equipment for preserving food, such as canning jars and smoking chambers. These innovations didn't just improve the efficiency of food preservation, they also opened up new possibilities for how settlers could store food and share it with others. Canning, for example, revolutionized the way food could be preserved for long periods, allowing settlers to store their harvests for months or even years. Yet, despite the many advances in food preservation, it is important to remember that these methods were not foolproof. Preserved food could spoil, become contaminated, or lose its flavor. The unpredictability of food preservation meant that settlers had to be constantly vigilant, checking their stores and making adjustments as needed. Sometimes the fruits of their labor would go to waste, and the harsh realities of colonial life would set in. Yet, it was the constant effort to preserve food that allowed these early American communities to thrive, adapting, learning, and innovating as they faced new challenges. But one of the most profound impacts of food preservation was the way it connected settlers to the land. Preserving food required a deep knowledge of the seasons, the crops, and the local environment. It demanded that settlers not only understand how to grow food, but also how to work with nature to store and maintain it. Food preservation was an act of respect for the land, a recognition that survival depended on the ability to understand and harness nature's cycles. The question we must consider now is, how did these preservation methods shape the settlers' relationship with their environment? Were these early practices a form of domination over nature, or did they reflect a more symbiotic relationship, one in which settlers learned to live in harmony with the land, respecting its rhythms and cycles? Food preservation was not just a way of keeping food safe, it was a way of ensuring the survival of culture, community, and identity. As we move on to the next section, we will explore how these food preservation techniques influenced the way early settlers thought about their food, their economy, and their culture. What role did food play in shaping colonial identity, and how did these practices continue to influence? The impact of colonial food preservation techniques extends far beyond the early years of American settlement. In fact, the methods developed by the first settlers laid the foundation for much of the modern food industry and shaped the way we approach food storage and preservation today. The process of preserving food, once a matter of survival, slowly evolved into an intricate part of American culinary culture, eventually becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry. In the early colonial years, food preservation was a means to ensure survival. It was about making sure there was enough food for the harsh winters, when fresh food was not available. However, by the mid-18th century, food preservation began to be understood not just as a survival strategy, but as a way to preserve flavor, maintain nutritional value, and keep food available throughout the year. What started as a necessity gradually evolved into an art form, with techniques and recipes being passed down through generations. The art of canning that we know today, for example, has its roots in the preservation techniques pioneered in colonial kitchens. The earliest forms of canning, while rudimentary, were already practiced by colonial settlers who used glass jars or stoneware crocks to store their pickled vegetables and fruits. The true breakthrough in canning came in the early 19th century with Nicolas Appert, a Frenchman who developed a method of sealing food in airtight containers and then heating them to preserve freshness. This technique revolutionized food preservation and would later make its way into American homes, changing how food could be stored for long periods. Colonial methods of preserving food through drying also paved the way for the development of today's dehydrated food industry. Dried fruits, meats, and vegetables were among the most common items preserved during the colonial era, and today, the same techniques are used to produce items like freeze-dried meals, trail mix, and even instant soup. Though the technology behind these modern methods has advanced, the basic principle of removing moisture to prevent spoilage remains the same. It's fascinating to think that the dried apples or jerky that settlers consumed centuries ago helped establish a foundation for the vast global market in dried foods today. Another legacy of colonial food preservation is pickling. Though pickling originated long before the colonial period, it was during this time that pickled foods became a staple in the American diet. Pickled cucumbers, onions, beets, and even pickled eggs were regularly made, not just as a means of preservation, but as an integral part of the meal. Today, pickling is still an important part of American cuisine, especially in regions with rich agricultural traditions. The rise of the artisanal food movement has brought about a resurgence of pickling, with home cooks experimenting with new types of pickled vegetables and even fruits. The craft of pickling is no longer just about preservation, but about taste and creativity. However, perhaps the most profound and far-reaching impact of colonial food preservation practices is the way they shaped modern food culture. In colonial America, food preservation was deeply tied to the seasons, the land, and the community. It was about making the most of what the land provided and ensuring that the community could sustain itself through the winter months. This intimate connection between food, community, and the land would later shape American food culture, which has always emphasized regional variety and seasonality. As the nation grew and urbanized, these food preservation techniques also evolved to meet the needs of a more industrialized society. With the advent of modern refrigeration and mass production, many of the practices that once defined daily life in colonial kitchens began to disappear. However, the importance of food preservation remained. Canning, freezing, and refrigeration became essential for meeting the demands of a growing population. The once painstaking process of preserving food by hand in small kitchens was replaced by large-scale industrial production of canned goods, frozen foods, and other preserved products. Yet, even as industrial food preservation took over, many of the core ideas from colonial kitchens remained central to American food culture. For example, the idea of seasonal eating, so central to colonial life, has seen a resurgence in recent years. Farm-to-table movements, local farmers' markets, and community-supported agriculture (CSA) programs all trace their roots back to a time when food preservation was about adapting to the seasons and making the most of the harvest. Similarly, the DIY food movement, which includes homemade preserves, jams, pickles, and cured meats, has been making a comeback in modern kitchens as people seek to reconnect with the traditions and flavors of the past. In this way, the legacy of colonial food preservation is still alive today, not just in the jars of homemade pickles and jam we keep in our kitchens, but in the way we think about and approach food. The practices of the past, once born out of necessity, have become part of the fabric of modern food culture, shaping everything from the way we cook to the way we value local, sustainable food. The question that arises from this reflection is, what can we learn from the colonial approach to food preservation that might help us face the challenges of today? In a world where food waste is a growing concern and sustainability is an ever more pressing issue, Could the lessons learned in colonial kitchens offer insights into how we can better preserve and respect the food we grow? In the face of climate change and resource scarcity, the wisdom of the past, rooted in careful stewardship of food, could offer guidance for the future. Looking back at the colonial kitchen, we realize that food preservation was never just a mundane task. It was an act of innovation, adaptation, and community. The settlers not only learned to live with the land, they shaped their relationship with it, ensuring that the land would continue to provide for them through clever, resourceful methods of food preservation. As we close this chapter, we are left with a deeper appreciation for the slow revolution that began in colonial kitchens. What started as a matter of survival became a tradition, a cultural touchstone, and ultimately a lasting influence on how we think about food today. The legacy of colonial food preservation is not just a reminder of how we've evolved as a nation, but also a call to remember the importance of sustainability, community, and innovation in our own kitchens. In the 19th century, the United States was in the midst of rapid growth and industrialization. Cities were expanding at an unprecedented rate, and with that expansion came the challenges of managing public health. The country was experiencing an influx of immigrants, the rise of factories, and a boom in urbanization that brought people closer together than ever before. But with this growth came a dark side: disease. Public health systems were still rudimentary, and the understanding of sanitation and hygiene was far from what it is today. In fact, many of the battles against disease that we now take for granted were fought in silence by everyday Americans who struggled against the invisible forces of illness with whatever knowledge and resources they had at their disposal. The 19th century saw devastating outbreaks of diseases like cholera, yellow fever, and tuberculosis. Diseases that claimed thousands of lives each year. The science of medicine was in its infancy, and doctors had limited knowledge about how diseases spread or how to effectively treat them. For most people, the understanding of disease was still rooted in ancient theories, like the belief in bad humors or miasma, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air from decaying organic matter. One of the greatest challenges faced by 19th century Americans was the lack of sanitation. Many cities, especially as they grew, lacked proper sewage systems, leading to contaminated water sources. Waste often flowed freely through the streets, and without modern plumbing, people were forced to rely on primitive methods of waste disposal. In fact, during the early part of the century, many urban areas had no public toilets, and people used chamber pots, which were dumped into the streets or into nearby bodies of water. This unsanitary environment was a breeding ground for disease, particularly for waterborne illnesses like cholera and dysentery. Despite these grim realities, Americans during this time were not completely helpless. The hygiene revolution of the 19th century was not sudden, but it was steady and driven by the efforts of individuals and small groups who were determined to improve public health. Many of these efforts were based on trial and error, and while medical knowledge was still limited, significant progress was made in understanding the importance of cleanliness. One of the first steps in this revolution was the recognition of the importance of clean water. It may seem obvious today, but in the 1800s, it wasn't understood that water could be contaminated by sewage and waste. The waterborne transmission of diseases like cholera was not widely accepted until the latter half of the century, and even then, it took time for widespread public health reforms to be put in place. But the first breakthrough came in the mid-19th century with the work of scientists like John Snow. In 1854, Snow traced a cholera outbreak in London to a contaminated water pump, helping to establish the idea that clean water was essential for public health. Though Snow's work was not immediately accepted in the United States, his findings would eventually lay the groundwork for modern public health efforts. The spread of infectious diseases like yellow fever also had a profound impact on how Americans began to think about hygiene. In the early part of the century, yellow fever epidemics in cities like New Orleans and Philadelphia led to widespread panic. No one understood how the disease spread or how to prevent it, and as a result, cities were often paralyzed by fear. Theories about yellow fever were numerous, ranging from the belief that it was caused by bad air to the idea that it was carried by mosquitoes. But it wasn't until the late 19th century that the true cause of yellow fever was discovered. In 1900, a commission led by Walter Reed proved that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, a breakthrough that would change the way Americans approached disease prevention. But while the scientific community was slowly making strides, the public was often left to its own devices. People began to adopt personal hygiene practices as a means of protecting themselves from disease, often without the benefit of modern understanding. Bathing, for instance, was considered important, but was not as common as we might think today. The idea that daily bathing was essential to maintaining health didn't become widespread until the later part of the century. Before that, many people would bathe only when they felt it was absolutely necessary. The development of public baths in cities became a significant step in improving public hygiene, although they were often crowded and lacked the cleanliness we would expect today. Yet, as the century progressed, Americans slowly began to make connections between personal hygiene and public health. The idea of washing hands after using the toilet or before preparing food started to gain acceptance, and disinfection methods like boiling water and scrubbing surfaces became more common. However, much of this progress was slow, and it was often driven by outbreaks of disease that forced people to confront the need for change. But how did people manage day to day? Were there smaller scale, individual efforts to improve hygiene that helped make a difference? How did communities organize to improve health before the formal development of a public health infrastructure? The answers lie in the growing awareness of the need for personal and communal action. Americans, despite the many challenges they faced, began to realize that small changes, better water, improved sanitation, and more attention to cleanliness, could make a difference in preventing the spread of disease. In the next section, we will explore some of the practical measures that individuals and communities took in the 19th century to fight disease. These efforts, while not always scientifically sound, paved the way for the hygiene practices we now take for granted. And they, as Americans grappled with the public health challenges of the 19th century, many took matters into their own hands by implementing various personal hygiene and sanitation practices that would later form the foundation of modern public health systems. While these measures were not always based on scientific principles, they were an essential part of the broader hygiene revolution that would gradually reduce the spread of disease and improve living conditions, especially in urban areas. One of the most critical measures in the fight against disease was the improvement of water supply systems. As we saw earlier, the work of scientists like John Snow, who traced cholera outbreaks to contaminated water sources, was pivotal in understanding the link between dirty water and disease transmission. Even before the full scientific explanation of waterborne diseases became widely accepted, Americans began taking practical steps to improve their water supply. In cities, wells were increasingly replaced with cleaner, safer public water systems. Urban planners began to build aqueducts and reservoirs, allowing for the transportation of clean water into households and communities. While urban infrastructure improvements were often slow and sporadic, many American cities did make significant strides in the latter half of the 19th century. New York City, for example, completed its Croton Aqueduct system in 1842, bringing fresh water from the Croton River in upstate New York to the growing metropolis. Other cities followed suit, recognizing that the lack of clean water was directly linked to disease outbreaks like cholera and typhoid. But it wasn't just about water supply. Many early American households began using more sanitary practices in their homes as a way of combating illness. People started to clean their homes more frequently, and the concept of cleanliness slowly took hold as a basic tenet of good health. In urban areas, the growing need for sanitation led to the development of the public sewer systems that became standard in major cities by the end of the century. These systems helped to move waste away from densely populated areas and reduce the risk of contamination from human waste in water supplies. Sanitary sewers, which carried waste to treatment facilities or out of the city, became a major focus of public health reform. On a personal level, bathing became more common as people began to see the direct connection between hygiene and health. In the early part of the century, bathing was a less frequent activity, and it wasn't until the latter half of the 19th century that daily bathing became more widespread in American homes. This change was partly driven by the rise of public bathhouses in cities, which provided affordable and accessible places for people to bathe. Public bathhouses were particularly important for working-class families who didn't have the resources to set up private bathrooms. Many cities built bathhouses as part of a broader public health effort to improve hygiene and prevent disease. The rising popularity of public bathing was also connected to the emergence of personal cleanliness products, such as soap, which were produced on a larger scale by industrial factories. With the rise of the soap industry, particularly companies like Ivory Soap, which started in the 1850s, Americans had access to affordable cleaning products that allowed them to maintain better hygiene at home. By the late 19th century, soap was a common household item, and the practice of hand washing, which is now one of the most basic hygiene habits, started to take hold. The importance of hand washing was not fully understood until later, but people began to make the connection between clean hands and reduced illness. In addition to bathing and hand washing, other personal hygiene measures also gained traction. Brushing teeth became more common during this period, especially with the invention of toothpaste in the 1850s. Before that, many people relied on rudimentary methods to clean their teeth, such as using rags or brushes made of twigs. But as access to better dental care and hygiene products increased, toothpaste and toothbrushes became more widespread, improving oral health and preventing the spread of germs that could lead to dental diseases or other infections. Despite the advances in personal hygiene, many Americans still lived in close quarters in crowded cities, which made it difficult to maintain good sanitary practices. Overcrowded housing, especially in urban slums, presented a particular challenge to public health. Families often lived in cramped tenements with little access to fresh air or sunlight, which created a breeding ground for disease. In response to these conditions, reformers began to push for better living conditions in cities, advocating for improved housing, cleaner streets, and access to fresh water. Public health campaigns played a key role in spreading awareness about sanitation and hygiene. These campaigns were often led by doctors, nurses, and public health advocates who worked to educate communities about the importance of cleanliness in preventing disease. One of the most significant efforts was the push for quarantines during disease outbreaks, particularly during yellow fever and cholera epidemics. In these cases, authorities would isolate infected individuals and sometimes entire neighborhoods in an effort to limit the spread of disease. Though quarantine measures were not always successful and sometimes met with resistance, they were an important part of early public health strategy. By the end of the 19th century, the growing awareness of hygiene and sanitation was beginning to transform American cities. The shift from accepting disease as an inevitable part of life to understanding that cleanliness and sanitary practices could prevent illness marked a major step forward in the development of modern public health systems. But the key question is, how did these early public health reforms and personal hygiene practices lay the groundwork for the healthcare system we know today? The answer lies in the cumulative impact of these small individual changes. The sanitation revolution of the 19th century paved the way for the establishment of formal health systems, the creation of health departments, and the widespread acceptance of the idea that government had a responsibility to protect public health. The work of reformers, doctors, and everyday people who took action to improve sanitation helped to set the stage for the public health policies and disease control systems that we now rely on. As we move forward in this story, we will explore the lasting legacy of these early hygiene practices. How did the scientific understanding of disease transmission evolve, and how did it shape the rise of modern medicine? What role did public health advocates play in building by the end of the 19th century, the hygiene revolution had fundamentally reshaped the way Americans thought about health, cleanliness, and disease. The efforts to improve sanitation, promote personal hygiene, and prevent the spread of infectious diseases were not just important steps toward controlling epidemics. They were the foundation of what would later become the modern public health system. One of the most profound legacies of the 19th century hygiene revolution was the establishment of public health infrastructure. As Americans began to understand the importance of sanitation and cleanliness in preventing disease, local, state, and federal governments started to take action. The creation of health boards and the development of public health policies helped lay the groundwork for the healthcare systems we rely on today. The role of public health departments became critical in organizing efforts to monitor and control diseases. In the early 1900s, cities and states established boards of health tasked with overseeing sanitation, controlling the spread of disease, and promoting hygiene practices. These health boards were often led by doctors and public health experts who had recognized the value of improving sanitation as a means of preventing illness. Their work led to the development of policies that addressed water quality, waste management, food safety, and other areas of public health. One of the most significant developments during this period was the establishment of sewage systems in cities across the United States. By the early 20th century, cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia had constructed advanced sewer systems that carried waste away from densely populated urban areas. The introduction of these systems drastically reduced the incidence of waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery, which had once ravaged cities. The realization that clean water and proper waste disposal were essential to public health became a cornerstone of modern sanitation. In parallel with the improvement of sanitation, the development of vaccines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries revolutionized the fight against infectious diseases. The discovery of vaccines for diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis marked a turning point in the history of medicine. Vaccines became a vital tool in the prevention of diseases that had once caused widespread death and suffering. The implementation of vaccination programs, particularly in urban areas, helped to eradicate diseases that had plagued the population for centuries. Public health campaigns also began to focus on preventative care, teaching people about the importance of maintaining personal hygiene to avoid the spread of disease. The concept of health education grew during this time, with experts working to inform the public about proper sanitation practices, the importance of washing hands, and the need for clean living environments. These efforts were often spearheaded by nurses, doctors, and community leaders who recognized that the best way to prevent disease was to educate people about how it spread and what they could do to avoid it. While these advances in hygiene and public health were a huge step forward, they were not without challenges. The rapid growth of cities, coupled with the ongoing issues of poverty and overcrowding, meant that many Americans continued to live in unsanitary conditions well into the 20th century. Poor neighborhoods often lacked access to clean water, proper waste disposal, and healthcare, leading to ongoing health disparities. The public health system would continue to grapple with these issues for decades, but the groundwork for modern healthcare systems had already been laid. As we moved into the 20th century, the understanding of disease transmission and prevention expanded thanks to the work of germ theory pioneers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, who proved that many diseases were caused by microorganisms. This scientific breakthrough led to the development of antibiotics and antiseptics, which further transformed medicine and hygiene. As germ theory took hold, the importance of sterilization in medical settings became clear, and practices like sterilizing surgical instruments and disinfecting hospital rooms became standard. By the mid-20th century, the widespread use of antibiotics, vaccines, and improved sanitation systems had dramatically reduced the incidence of infectious diseases. The global campaigns to eradicate diseases like smallpox and polio were direct descendants of the early public health initiatives that had emerged in the 19th century. The efforts of early reformers, doctors, and public health advocates had a lasting impact on the health and well-being of millions of people. In the context of modern health, the legacy of the 19th century hygiene revolution remains incredibly relevant. Many of the public health systems we now take for granted, water treatment, waste management, disease control, and vaccination programs, are the result of efforts that began in the 19th century. Even today, the principles of preventative care, cleanliness, and education that were championed during this time continue to shape our approach to health. As we reflect on this transformation, we are reminded of the incredible resilience of communities in the face of disease. It took decades of struggle, innovation, and education for public health to be recognized as a critical part of modern society. The shift from a time when disease was largely accepted as an inevitable part of life to the modern understanding that cleanliness, sanitation, and preventative care can reduce the spread of illness marked a profound shift in both medical practice and social policy. And so, we are left to ask, how can the lessons of the 19th century, when people fought to make their communities healthier, inform the way we address public health challenges today? The fight against modern-day pandemics, environmental health threats, and disease outbreaks will undoubtedly benefit from the same spirit of innovation, education, and collective action that defined the hygiene revolution of the 19th century. The year 1819 marks a dark chapter in the economic history of the United States, a chapter that is often overlooked in favor of the more well-known financial crises of later centuries. But the Panic of 1819 was America's first nationwide economic depression, a crisis that left deep scars on both the economy and the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. To understand this panic, we need to step back and examine the conditions leading up to it, the impact it had on the country, and the lessons it left for future generations. The post-war of 1812 period in America was initially one of hope and opportunity. The nation had just emerged victorious from a costly conflict with Britain, and Americans were eager to build and expand. The federal government, under President James Monroe, was focused on a vision of national growth through infrastructure development, territorial expansion, and economic stability. The American system, championed by Henry Clay, sought to unify the nation through internal improvements such as roads, canals, and the establishment of a national bank. For a time, the country experienced a period of optimism that came to be known as the era of good feelings. But beneath the surface of this optimism, economic instability was brewing. One of the key players in this instability was the Second Bank of the United States, established in 1816. The bank was tasked with stabilizing the economy and providing a uniform currency for the nation. However, it quickly became a source of contention. State-chartered banks relied on the national bank's policies, but they had a tendency to issue excessive amounts of paper currency, a practice known as over-speculation. As banks pumped more and more money into the economy, people were able to take out loans to invest in land, agriculture, and business ventures with little regard for whether they could actually pay them back. This led to a booming economy, especially in the Western territories where land speculation was rampant. Farmers and land investors eagerly bought up land in newly acquired territories, confident that the price of land would continue to rise. The assumption was that the national bank would continue to provide ample credit, and the government would support this expansion. But this unchecked enthusiasm came with a price. As the economy continued to expand and the money supply increased, inflation began to rise. Land prices skyrocketed, and speculators drove the prices even higher, believing that land would only continue to appreciate. Yet, as often happens in speculative bubbles, the system was unsustainable. In 1818, the National Bank, under the leadership of Nicholas Biddle, began to recognize the growing instability in the economy. To prevent further inflation, the bank made the decision to restrict credit, tightening the money supply. This action had immediate and dramatic consequences. With the availability of easy credit suddenly drying up, the speculative bubble began to burst. Land prices fell sharply, and many speculators were unable to pay back their loans. As a result, banks began to fail, and businesses were forced to close. In 1819, the full impact of the economic collapse was felt across the nation. The Panic of 1819 set off a chain reaction of bankruptcies, job losses, and unemployment. Western farmers who had invested heavily in land found themselves in deep debt, unable to pay back loans. Many were forced to lose their land, and the value of property plummeted. In cities, factory workers and tradesmen faced job cuts and wage reductions. Unemployment soared, and the economy ground to a halt. But the panic didn't just affect the economy. It also had a profound political and social impact. The economic collapse weakened the public's confidence in the national bank and the government's ability to regulate the economy. Many Americans, particularly those in the West, began to see the national bank as a tool of the elite, a central authority that did not understand the struggles of ordinary citizens. This led to growing opposition to the bank and its policies, which eventually played a role in the Bank War of the 1830s, when President Andrew Jackson would famously fight to dismantle the Second Bank of the United States. The Panic of 1819 also marked a turning point in the public perception of economic instability. For the first time in the young nation's history, Americans realized that the economy was not immune to the boom and bust cycles that had plagued Europe. It forced people to confront the idea that their nation's economy was vulnerable to forces beyond their control, such as speculation, inflation, and the manipulation of credit. But despite the turmoil, the Panic of 1819 was not the end of America's economic ambitions. In fact, it served as a wake-up call, a lesson in the dangers of unchecked speculation and the need for more regulation and oversight in the banking system. As the country moved into the 1820s, reforms were gradually introduced to stabilize the economy and reduce the risks of future financial crises. Yet the Panic of 1819 also exposed some of the deeper challenges of early American capitalism. The economic collapse hit farmers and landowners the hardest, especially in the West, where land speculation had been rampant. In these areas, the agrarian economy was the backbone of local communities, and the loss of land was often devastating. The economic hardship of the panic became a part of the larger debate over the future of American economic policy, whether the country should continue to embrace the free market principles of capitalism, or whether it needed a stronger regulatory framework to protect its citizens. The long-term consequences of the Panic of 1819 were significant. In the years that followed, political factions in the US began to diverge more sharply. The issues of state versus federal authority, the role of the national bank, and economic regulation all became central to the political discourse. These debates would eventually lead to the rise of the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs, both of which would push for competing visions of America's economic future. But what can we learn from this early economic crisis, and how did it shape the way Americans approached economic policy in the years that followed? The Panic of 1819 was a painful but important lesson in the risks of speculation and the need for more sound economic practices. It helped establish the importance of financial oversight, the need for banking reform, and the recognition that economic booms are often followed by inevitable busts. This crisis, though largely forgotten in modern narratives, was one of the first major tests for the young republic's economic system. The economic fallout from the Panic of 1819 was far-reaching, and its effects rippled through every layer of American society, but its political and social impact was especially significant. The economic collapse did not just cause financial ruin, it led to deep divisions in the country and intensified existing political tensions. For many Americans, the panic was a stark reminder of how fragile the nation's economy was and how easily it could be manipulated by speculation and the actions of powerful institutions. For everyday Americans, the panic was devastating. Those who had speculated in land or borrowed money from banks were hit hardest. Farmers in the West, who had taken out loans to purchase land, found themselves suddenly unable to repay their debts. Land values plummeted, leaving many with worthless property and financial ruin. In some cases, entire families lost their farms, with devastating consequences for their livelihoods. This mass foreclosure crisis left many people with no choice but to start over, often in unfamiliar territory. The working class in cities also felt the brunt of the economic collapse. Factories and industries that had been thriving in the early years of the 19th century experienced mass layoffs, and wage cuts became a common feature of the urban labor market. For many factory workers, the panic brought job insecurity and growing poverty. The sense of economic vulnerability grew as people realized that the wealth created during the early years of the Republic could disappear almost overnight. This created a rising sense of disillusionment with the system, one that would later fuel populist movements and calls for greater economic equality. However, it wasn't just the poor and working class who were affected. Even those who had previously benefited from the booming economy, the land speculators, wealthy merchants, and banking elites found themselves under scrutiny. Many of the same elites who had driven the speculative bubble were now being blamed for the crash. As financial institutions collapsed, the wealthy and powerful found their own businesses in jeopardy. The panic exposed the deep inequities of the economic system, which benefited a select few while leaving the majority of the population vulnerable to the whims of speculation and market forces. The political impact of the panic was profound. As the economic collapse unfolded, the role of the national bank, which had been central to the nation's financial system, became a flashpoint in political debates. For many Americans, particularly in the West and South, the bank's policies were seen as contributing to the crisis. The bank had been accused of inflating the money supply by issuing too many loans and promoting risky land speculation. As the crisis deepened, it became clear that the national bank was both a source of instability and a symbol of centralized financial power. Opposition to the bank became a rallying cry for those who believed in the power of states' rights and who were increasingly suspicious of centralized power in Washington. The backlash against the national bank was especially strong in the West, where many farmers and landowners had been severely impacted by the speculative collapse. They saw the bank as an institution that favored the elite, especially in the East, at the expense of ordinary citizens. The panic set the stage for future debates about federalism, the role of banks, and the proper regulation of the economy. In response to these tensions, political factions began to coalesce. The Democratic-Republican Party, which had been the dominant political force during the early years of the Republic, began to divide. On one side, you had the state's rights-oriented wing, led by figures like Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, who began to advocate for a more limited role for the federal government in economic matters. They argued that the national bank was a threat to individual liberty and economic freedom. On the other side were those who believed that the federal government should take a more active role in managing the economy and overseeing the banking system, including leaders like Henry Clay, who advocated for a strong national bank and internal improvements. The Panic of 1819 was a pivotal moment in the rise of what would become the Jacksonian Democrats, who would come to dominate American politics in the 1820s and 1830s. Jackson's opposition to the national bank and his subsequent bank war would become central to his presidency. For many, the crisis marked the beginning of a new era in American politics, one in which issues of economic inequality, banking regulation, and the role of government in the economy would dominate the national conversation. The Panic of 1819 also left a lasting imprint on economic theory and the future direction of the US economy. The crisis revealed the dangers of speculative bubbles and the potential for financial instability in a growing nation. It forced policymakers, economists, and political leaders to rethink the way they approached economic regulation and financial institutions. The idea that the economy could be manipulated by unchecked speculation led to calls for more regulation, more transparency, and more government oversight of financial markets. At the same time, the panic was a reminder of the difficulties of maintaining a stable economy in a young country with limited financial infrastructure. The US was still in the process of developing a central banking system and monetary policies that would provide long-term stability. The crisis made it clear that without sound regulation, the economy could easily be swept up in speculative cycles that could leave ordinary Americans vulnerable to boom and bust cycles. Perhaps one of the most significant economic consequences of the Panic of 1819 was the growing influence of state-chartered banks. As the national bank faltered and the economy collapsed, many people began to rely on state banks for loans and credit. These local financial institutions were often more flexible than the national bank, but they were also more prone to over-speculation and unregulated lending, which would lead to further financial instability in the decades to come. The political and economic aftermath of the Panic of 1819 set the stage for the rise of the modern banking system in the US. It also contributed to the growing belief that financial institutions needed to be more responsive to the needs of ordinary people, especially in the face of speculative booms and busts. While the US would not fully address these issues until the reforms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Panic of 1819 highlighted the need for financial reform, economic stability, and a more regulated financial system. As the dust settled after the Panic of 1819, the US found itself in a period of deep reflection and reconstruction. The financial collapse left lasting scars on the nation's economy, but it also set the stage for crucial reforms, both in economic policy and in the political structures of the country. The lessons learned from the crisis though painful at the time, would shape the way Americans approached economic stability and governance for generations to come. One of the key lessons of the Panic of 1819 was the recognition that unchecked speculation and overexpansion could destabilize the economy. The years leading up to the crisis had been marked by a speculative bubble, driven by land speculation and easy access to credit. The collapse of that bubble made it clear that a more regulated and controlled approach to banking and lending was needed. But it would take time for the federal government to put safeguards in place. In the immediate aftermath of the panic, the federal government began to focus on establishing a more stable economic framework. The Second Bank of the United States, which had been a target of criticism during the panic, came under greater scrutiny. The national bank was viewed by many as both a necessary institution for stabilizing the economy and a dangerous tool for economic control in the hands of the elite. This duality would fuel the bank war of the 1830s, when President Andrew Jackson famously opposed the bank and vetoed its re-charter, believing that its power was detrimental to the common people. Although Jackson's fight against the national bank was a major political battle, it also signaled a shift in American economic policy. Jackson's policies would move the country towards a decentralized banking system with state-chartered banks. While this allowed for more localized control, it also left the economy vulnerable to the kinds of speculative risks that had contributed to the Panic of 1819. It would take several decades before stronger banking regulations and financial oversight would be implemented, following the Panic of 1837 and other subsequent crises. Another critical lesson from the Panic of 1819 was the need for the federal government to take a more active role in regulating the economy. The idea of government intervention in the economy, though controversial at the time, became more widely accepted as the US moved further into the 19th century. While many believed in the principles of free market capitalism, the collapse made clear that there were limits to how much the market could be left unchecked. The post-1819 period saw growing calls for infrastructure investment and economic planning to ensure the country's stability. The government began to focus on programs that would stimulate economic growth without allowing it to spiral out of control. This shift in policy laid the groundwork for future debates over economic regulation, especially as the country expanded westward and the Industrial Revolution took root. In the years following the Panic of 1819, internal improvements like the construction of roads and canals became more common. Henry Clay's American system sought to unite the nation through infrastructure projects that would facilitate the movement of goods and people across the country. The idea was to create a more unified national economy that could weather financial storms and promote sustainable growth. The Panic of 1819 also had lasting political and social effects. The economic hardships caused by the panic led to growing discontent with the political establishment. Many Americans, especially in the West and South, felt that the government and banking institutions were controlled by elites who didn't understand the struggles of everyday people. The economic hardships exacerbated class divisions, and the frustration over perceived inequality became a driving force behind the political changes of the 1820s and 1830s. The panic marked the beginning of increasing political polarization, especially over issues related to banking and economic control. The opposition to the national bank became a central issue in the rise of the Jacksonian Democrats. Andrew Jackson's political ideology of populism and states' rights gained strength as he positioned himself as the champion of the common man, railing against the elites who controlled the financial system. Jackson's fight against the national bank was part of a larger political struggle between those who believed in a strong federal government and those who advocated for greater local control and less federal intervention. Simultaneously, the panic and its aftermath helped to fuel the rise of the Whig Party which advocated for a more active federal role in economic development. The Whigs believed that a strong national bank, internal improvements, and federal investment were necessary to ensure national prosperity and stability. The debate between the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs would dominate American politics for much of the 19th century. In the long term, the Panic of 1819 became an important moment in the development of the United States financial system and its political structure. Though the immediate effects of the panic were severe, the lessons learned from the crisis ultimately led to a more regulated and sophisticated banking system. It also led to a broader understanding of the risks of speculative bubbles and the importance of careful economic planning. The financial instability exposed by the panic also set the stage for future reforms. In the following decades, the government would pass a series of important banking laws, and the country would experience the rise of regulatory institutions that sought to balance the power of private banks with the need for economic stability. The Federal Reserve System, established in 1913, would later serve as a key institution in managing the US economy, controlling inflation, and overseeing the financial system. Moreover, the Panic of 1819 set the stage for future public debates on the role of government in the economy. The principles of financial regulation, credit control, and inflation management, which were discussed and debated during the early 19th century, remain at the heart of economic policy debates today. The economic upheaval also shaped the country's social fabric, pushing Americans to confront the realities of financial instability and inequality. The aftermath of the panic made clear the need for better safeguards to protect people from financial collapse and the risk of losing everything. These concerns continue to resonate today as issues like income inequality, banking regulation, and financial crises remain central to political discourse. The Panic of 1819 serves as an important reminder of the cyclical nature of financial crises and the vulnerabilities of a growing economy. It showed that economic growth, while beneficial, can sometimes lead to overconfidence and instability. The crisis demonstrated the importance of sound financial practices and regulation, while also highlighting the need for a balance between government intervention and free market principles. As we look at the modern financial system, we can trace many of its principles and regulations back to the lessons learned from this early crisis. The legacy of the Panic of 1819 continues to influence economic policy today, reminding us of the need for vigilance, regulation, and the protection of the most vulnerable in times of financial instability. In the early 19th century, the United States was a country of vast distances, and travel between the eastern and western parts of the nation was slow, dangerous, and expensive. The dream of connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean through a man-made waterway began to take shape in the early 1800s with the ambitious proposal of the Erie Canal. This canal, once completed, would become one of the most important infrastructure projects in the United States, dramatically changing the way goods were transported and expanding the economic reach of the nation. But the story of the Erie Canal is not just one of visionaries and engineers. It's also the story of the laborers who built it, the struggles they endured, and the lasting impact of their work on the country's growth. The idea of the Erie Canal was first championed by Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York, who saw the potential to connect the burgeoning industrial cities of the East with the agricultural heartland of the West. At the time, the United States had no system of canals that could facilitate such an ambitious project. The nation's transportation infrastructure was limited, and the idea of a canal that would stretch across 363 miles of rugged terrain seemed nearly impossible. But Clinton and his supporters believed that it could transform the nation's economy and position New York City as the gateway to the western frontier. In 1817, construction of the Erie Canal officially began, and what followed was a decade-long effort to dig the canal, build locks, and carve a path through some of the most challenging and inhospitable landscapes in the United States. The engineering feat was monumental, and the labor needed to build it was immense. Thousands of men, most of whom were immigrants from Ireland, were hired to do the back-breaking work. These workers were paid poorly and lived in harsh conditions, often subjected to the grueling labor of digging, lifting, and transporting materials. The work was physically exhausting, and many men died from accidents, diseases, and poor living conditions. Yet despite the difficulty of the task, the construction of the Erie Canal proceeded, driven by a collective belief that it would bring prosperity to the region. Irish immigrants, many of whom had come to America seeking better opportunities, made up the bulk of the labor force. They were recruited because of the demand for cheap labor, and they found themselves facing both physical and social challenges. They worked in sweltering heat and freezing cold, with little to no medical care, often in dangerous conditions. Despite the hardships, they were determined to complete the task, and their contributions became a key part of the success of the canal project. However, the difficulties faced by the workers were not solely physical. Many were subjected to prejudices and discrimination, particularly the Irish immigrants, who were often viewed as expendable. They were frequently segregated from other workers and subjected to poor treatment, even as they carried out some of the most vital and difficult tasks of construction. Their work was often overlooked in the historical narrative, and it is only in more recent years that their contributions have begun to receive the recognition they deserve. But despite the hardships, the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 changed the course of American history. The canal not only provided a more efficient and cheaper way to transport goods, but also played a pivotal role in the expansion of the American economy. It allowed for the easy movement of agricultural products from the interior of the country to markets in New York City and beyond, fueling industrial growth and contributing to the establishment of New York as a leading economic hub. While the story of the Erie Canal is often framed around the vision of DeWitt Clinton and the economic benefits it brought to New York, it's important to remember that it was the laborers, many of whom were Irish immigrants, who made the canal a reality. Their struggles, their sweat, and their sacrifices were an integral part of the canal's success, and their story deserves to be remembered as part of the broader narrative of American progress. But how did these workers persevere in the face of such adversity? What motivated them to continue working on a project that seemed impossible, knowing the dangers and hardships they would face? And why have their contributions been so overlooked by history? These are the questions we will explore in the next section as we look at the lives of the workers who built the. As we turn to the stories of the workers who built the Erie Canal, it's important to recognize that their experiences were as varied as the laborers themselves. While the canal's completion in 1825 was a monumental achievement that transformed the American economy, the men who worked tirelessly to build it, often under harsh and dangerous conditions, were the unsung heroes of the project. The contributions of these workers, especially the Irish immigrants who made up the bulk of the labor force, were often overlooked in the historical narrative, despite the fact that their efforts played a pivotal role in the canal's success. By far the largest group of workers on the Erie Canal were Irish immigrants. At the time, Ireland was experiencing a period of severe economic hardship, with many families struggling to survive due to a lack of opportunity and the harsh realities of life under British colonial rule. Famine, poverty, and political unrest had driven thousands of Irish men and women to seek a better life in the United States. Many of them found work on infrastructure projects like the Erie Canal, where they were able to earn a steady income and build a future for themselves. The Irish immigrants who worked on the canal faced a double burden. Not only were they subjected to difficult physical labor, but they were also discriminated against by many of the native-born Americans who saw them as inferior. Anti-Irish sentiment was widespread in the early 19th century, and the Irish were often relegated to the most dangerous and physically demanding tasks. They worked long hours, in dangerous conditions, with little regard for their safety. The sea. Men who worked on the canal were often forced to live in makeshift camps, with little access to proper food, shelter, or medical care. Despite these hardships, the Irish workers were critical to the canal's completion. They brought with them a strong work ethic and resilience, and their determination to succeed allowed them to endure the harsh conditions. They dug through miles of difficult terrain, building locks, bridges, and canals, and their perseverance helped push the project forward. The Irish workers' contribution to the canal's success cannot be overstated. Without them, the project may have faltered. The physical toll on workers was enormous. The labor was grueling, and many workers, especially the Irish immigrants, suffered from exhaustion, injury, and disease. The work itself was dangerous. Workers were often exposed to the elements and had to perform manual labor under hazardous conditions. Canal digging required the use of large, heavy tools, and the men who worked with them faced the risk of serious injury. The canal workers had to dig through dense forests, muddy swamps, and hilly terrain, often in extreme weather conditions. The camp life was harsh, with little comfort or privacy. Most of the workers lived in crowded, poorly constructed huts or tents exposed to the elements. Disease spread rapidly in these cramped quarters, and workers frequently contracted illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and malaria. Malnutrition was also a common problem, as food provisions were often scarce or of poor quality. Deaths from illness and accidents were not uncommon, and many workers never saw the completion of the canal. One particularly harsh reality was the treatment of women and children who accompanied some of the men working on the canal. These women were responsible for preparing meals, taking care of the sick, and managing the workers' camp. They often faced long hours of grueling work in unsanitary conditions, and like their male counterparts, they were vulnerable to disease. It is estimated that hundreds of workers, men, women, and children, lost their lives over the course of the canal's construction. Though the labor of the workers was essential, the role of local and state governments in facilitating the canal's construction was equally important. The state of New York, under the leadership of Governor DeWitt Clinton, provided much of the financial backing and political support for the canal project. Clinton's vision for the canal was grounded in the belief that it would open up trade, routes between the Western Territories and New York City, fueling the state's economic growth. Clinton's campaign for the canal, despite fierce opposition from many of his political rivals, ultimately secured the state's commitment to funding the project. While the state's political and financial support was vital, the real challenge was in organizing and managing the massive labor force that was needed to complete the canal. The sheer scale of the project meant that thousands of workers were required, and the logistics of organizing such a workforce were staggering. The canal project was one of the largest and most ambitious engineering efforts of the early 19th century, and the labor force had to be constantly managed to ensure that the work was completed efficiently. But despite the massive effort of both the government and the workers, the completion of the canal was never guaranteed. The workers' struggles, combined with the financial and political challenges of the project, meant that the canal's future was in doubt at several points during its construction. Yet, the persistence of the workers, particularly the Irish immigrants, helped overcome the obstacles, and the canal was completed on time and within budget. When we think of the Erie Canal, We often focus on the visionaries, like DeWitt Clinton, who helped make it a reality. However, the real heroes of the canal's construction were the labourers, particularly the Irish immigrants, who worked tirelessly in the face of enormous hardships. They are the forgotten figures in the story of the Erie Canal, and their sacrifices have often been overlooked by historians and the public alike. The story of these workers is a reminder that the success of large-scale infrastructure projects often rests on the labour of the many, not just the efforts of the few. Their contributions were not only vital to the canal's construction, but they also paved the way for the future of American industry and transportation. The Erie Canal was a transformative project, connecting the interior of the country to the Atlantic Ocean, and without the labour of these workers, the project would have never been completed. Today, we remember the Erie Canal as an engineering triumph, a symbol of American ingenuity and progress. But we should also remember the men, women, and children who made it possible. Their stories are not just a footnote in the history of the canal, they are the heart of the canal's legacy. As we look back on the Erie Canal's impact on the nation, we must ask, how many other unsung heroes like the Irish workers of the canal have shaped the history of the United States, their contributions erased or forgotten over time? The Erie Canal reminds us that the building of America was a collective effort, with many hands working tirelessly behind the scenes to create the nation we know today. The Erie Canal, once completed in 1825, was hailed as a marvel of engineering and a transformative force for the US economy. It was a symbol of American ingenuity and a testament to the country's potential for growth and expansion. Yet, as we consider its long-lasting impact, it is crucial to reflect on the unseen legacy of those who built it, the labourers, most notably the Irish immigrants, who worked in grueling conditions, facing dangers and hardships that we often overlook in the larger narrative of the canal's success. Their struggles not only contributed to the building of the canal, but also played a role in shaping the future of the American working class and the country's economy. The completion of the Erie Canal was, without question, a defining moment in the history of the United States. It provided a navigable waterway from New York City to the Great Lakes, opening up vast new territories to trade and settlement. The canal created an economic corridor that connected the agricultural heartland of the West with the bustling port of New York City, allowing goods such as grain, timber, and livestock to flow more easily to eastern markets. For the first time, settlers in the West had easy access to global trade routes, and New York City cemented its position as the nation's commercial hub. By drastically reducing the cost of transportation, the canal also facilitated the growth of industrialization. Factories and mills that had once been confined to regions with access to waterways or railroads now had access to materials and markets across the country. The canal accelerated the pace of industrial development in the United States, especially in the northern states, and encouraged the growth of cities along the canal route. Buffalo, in particular, experienced rapid growth, evolving from a small town to a major industrial city. But perhaps the most profound economic shift was seen in the West. The canal's completion helped to bind the nation together, spurring territorial expansion and the migration of settlers to new lands. As the canal made it easier to transport goods, the Western territories became more attractive for settlement. This helped to fuel the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the US was destined to expand across the North American continent. The Erie Canal was, in many ways, the beginning of this process, connecting the East with the West and providing the infrastructure needed to settle and develop new regions. While the canal's economic effects were profound, the social impact of the canal was equally significant. especially when it comes to the laborers who built it. The labor force, consisting largely of Irish immigrants, was subjected to horrific working conditions. Many of these men had arrived in the United States, fleeing poverty and famine in Ireland. They came to America seeking opportunities for a better life, but what they found was backbreaking labor in unsanitary, unsafe conditions, often with little compensation or recognition. Despite the hardships, the Irish workers played a vital role in the canal's construction, and their contributions would have lasting effects on American labor movements. The harsh working conditions on the Erie Canal would serve as a catalyst for the development of labor unions and workers' rights advocacy in the US. The struggle for fair wages, better working conditions, and the rights of immigrant workers would become important issues in the decades to come as the United States industrialized and labor forces became central to the nation's economy. The Irish laborers' role in the construction of the Erie Canal was not just an isolated chapter in history. It was part of a larger story of immigration and labor rights that would shape the future of the American working class. These workers faced discrimination, poor living conditions, and a complete lack of healthcare or safety standards. However, their resilience laid the groundwork for future generations of workers who would organize and fight for better treatment and labor laws. Their story is a reminder of the contributions of immigrant labor to the building of the nation and the difficult road they had to travel to earn recognition and rights. While the Irish immigrants' labor was crucial to the success of the Erie Canal, their contributions were largely forgotten in the mainstream historical narrative for many years. For decades, the focus of the Erie Canal story was on the engineering feat and the political figures like DeWitt Clinton, who championed the project. The workers, however, remained largely invisible in the telling of the story. This historical oversight of the laborers reflects a broader pattern of how immigrant contributions were often marginalized in American history. The Irish, in particular, were treated as second-class citizens during this period, facing both racism and prejudice. Their work on the canal, while essential, was not recognized at the time for its profound significance to the development of the country. However, in recent years, historians and advocates have begun to reclaim these forgotten stories. The Irish American community, in particular, has worked to ensure that the contributions of their ancestors are not overlooked. Monuments, museums, and historical sites dedicated to the workers who built the Erie Canal have started to emerge, helping to correct the historical record and honor their labor. The legacy of the Irish workers on the Erie Canal also serves as a reminder of the role of immigrant labor in the development of the United States. It highlights the struggles that immigrant workers faced in their pursuit of a better life, and the lasting impact they had on the nation's economy and infrastructure. These workers, who were once seen as expendable, now have their contributions celebrated as an integral part of America's growth. The Erie Canal's impact went beyond just economic and social changes. It also played a symbolic role in uniting the nation. At a time when the United States was still a young and divided nation, the canal helped to foster a sense of national identity and shared purpose. The canal physically and symbolically connected the eastern states to the western territories, bringing the nation closer together and making the concept of manifest destiny a reality. The canal also demonstrated the capacity for large-scale collaboration and ambitious engineering in the United States. It proved that America could undertake monumental projects, and its success inspired other infrastructure efforts, such as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The canal helped to set the stage for an era of expansion and industrialization, propelling the country into the 19th century with a new sense of confidence. But as we consider the lasting impact of the Erie Canal, we must also ask, How many of the unsung heroes of American history, like the Irish workers, have been overlooked in the broader narrative of the country's growth? How many stories of immigrant labor and sacrifice have been erased or forgotten in favor of celebrating the contributions of political leaders and wealthy elites? The Erie Canal reminds us that America's history is built on the backs of countless ordinary people whose stories deserve to be told and remembered. In closing, the Erie Canal is not just a physical structure that changed the course of American history. It is a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and unity. The forgotten laborers, especially the Irish immigrants who built the canal, left behind a legacy that continues to shape the country today. Their work, though largely invisible in historical records, was integral to the transformation of the American economy and the expansion of the nation.